Hey everyone, this is Derek from SDGC, and I'm here to give you my impressions on The Church in the Darkness. Paranoid Productions was kind enough to provide us 2 codes for PC for review, and while I didn't get enough time to experiment so deeply that I had seen every single thing the game had to offer, I've seen enough to offer what I feel like are accurate and good faith impressions on the game. While, as I mentioned, the codes we were provided were for PC, the game is also launching today on Xbox One, PlayStation 4, and Nintendo Switch. The Church in the Darkness is a sort of stealth action game with some randomized elements, not unlike what you might see in something like a roguelike. You play as an ex-law enforcement officer infiltrating a religious commune called Freedom Town in the heart of the jungle in order to try and retrieve your nephew, Alex. But this religious commune has really turned into something much more like a cult, with Jonestown being a very obvious point of historical reference. The general goal of an individual playthrough is to avoid detection, find and speak to one or more friendly members of the commune to help find your nephew, and see if he can be convinced to leave, which may also require you to find and speak with the preacher couple who run the commune. All of these characters can have slightly different personalities each time you play, with each one fitting into one of a few different versions of that character and requiring slightly different approaches. Alex, for example, may be desperate to leave Freedom Town, or he may be blissfully unaware of the danger he's in and requires some convincing in order to leave. Meanwhile, the preachers can range from being violent fanatics to somewhat more sympathetic and reluctant to violence. Sometimes this randomization doesn't fully click together. For example, there's a friendly character named Charles who may speak out against the extreme disciplinary tactics that the commune uses. However, you can sometimes find notes from him suggesting those same tactics because another version of that character is quick to support putting people in cages if they dissent. But you'll have found that note in a playthrough that contains the more pacifistic version of the character. The game is clearly meant to be played multiple times. Different difficulty levels, chosen starting equipment, and randomized personalities offer some variation, but ultimately I found myself following the same basic formula of sweeping the map for white chapels that contain information, hitting up the same couple of spots for friendly NPCs, going after Alex, and maybe dealing with the preachers as the situation dictated. Like I said, I haven't had the time to rigorously test every outcome, but endings do seem to be impacted by many factors, such as whether or not you can convince friendlies to take action, and how you deal with the preachers. Many of these potential story branches can effectively be skipped in every playthrough if you rush, but it also means you don't get closure on those side plots. And due to the stealth based nature of the game, chasing too many side plots can increase the chances that you'll eventually slip up. I did at times have to weigh whether it was worth me chasing some side story or another, or if I was biting off more than I could chew, and it would be safer for me to just go ahead and leave the commune. Even on lower difficulties, open combat with guards usually ends in failure. Running and gunning is not an option. Likewise, people can be non-lethally choked out, but they will wake up alarmed unless you do something like lock them in a cage. Thankfully, the cult is often willing to capture you rather than kill you, once or twice depending on the preacher's randomized personalities, and you can attempt to escape your cage and salvage the playthrough, although at times I've had capture also lead to execution. The game, unfortunately, just feels very shallow. On paper, there seems to be a decent number of methods and tools for reacting to different situations, but I found far and away the most success just by picking the villager disguise in the beginning and sprinting around, briefly tapping the sneak button every so often to see villagers' areas of detection. Even entering their areas of detection briefly wasn't an issue, as you can often sprint away or around a corner and ditch them before they become fully suspicious. To be honest, the only times I would die after my first couple playthroughs is when I would accidentally forget to tap the sneak button and run directly into a building with one or more enemies that I didn't know was there because I didn't see their threat cones. Due to the nature of the game's setting, it's impossible to fully divorce the game from its extremely political content, but the message is vague and muddled. The church and its followers are very patterned off of Jonestown in particular, and there are always undercurrents of violence, paranoia, and tyranny inside it to one degree or another. And while it's true that many religious cults of the time, including Jonestown, tried to marry communism with spirituality, it's very uncomfortable to be walking around this violent cult compound and hear the majority of propaganda blasted over the loudspeakers be pretty bog standard leftist criticism of the US government. I'm not saying you can't have a left-wing suicide cult. These things did exist, and again, Jonestown in particular is the inspiration for Freedom Town. But the choice to put so much leftist criticism that is still being used today into the mouths of said suicide cult has me raising an eyebrow. There's just not enough context in the game to really tell me what the developer's intended message about the cult is. And my fear is that a message that vague can easily be interpreted as criticism of some pretty bog-standard leftist concerns about equality and racial justice. If you want your villains to name-drop the Stonewall riots, you're stepping into pretty dangerous waters, and you need to handle that with more care. To be clear, I'm not saying that the developers are trying to be anti-equality. It more feels like they very carelessly use the language of leftist movements as window dressing for their communist suicide cult, without really thinking through what they might have been presenting. Overall, The Church in the Darkness is an interesting game, and I did find some enjoyment in my time with it, but it felt like a smaller and shallower game than I was seeing in promotional materials. I think that even if I didn't have issues with the way the game handles its political material, I probably still might not have spent much time with the game myself if I picked it up out of curiosity. Of course, I'm not the only one at SDGC who went hands-on with the game, so I'd like to kick it over to my buddy Matt for his impressions and to see how much he agrees and disagrees with me.
Hey everyone, Matthew from SDGC here to talk about Church in the Darkness, a new game that hit pretty much all platforms today, August 2nd, 2019. I'm going to be kind of brief because my boy Derek is giving a more in-depth look at it, but I really just wanted to drop kind of my quick impressions from a couple days of playthrough with it. The quick and dirty of it is, for the most part, it's an okay game. It's not what I was hoping when I first heard of it, because for those that don't know, the concept is really intriguing. It's basically a game based loosely on the Jamestown massacre from the 70s, the mass suicide with the cult and the charismatic leader, and everything went horribly awry. And that's the basis of this. Your nephew or some family member of yours gets caught up in a cult. You are sent by your family to get them out. And what occurs is a shifting narrative each time you play. The game itself is kind of like isometric style. It's the top-down. It's a twin-stick shooter at its core, because anytime you do have to do some shooting, it does become a twin-stick control scheme. So if you're playing one of those, you're going to be quite familiar with how this goes down. The twist in this, or maybe not twist, but the hook, the mechanic that makes it a little different than its ilk is it's not quite a roguelike. Although every time you fail or die, things do change. You do start fresh. You don't retain any equipment. Unlike traditional roguelites, there are no like stats or upgrades or things that really carry over in the normal sense. Now, you do start each playthrough with one item of your choice, and as you complete objectives and beat playthroughs, your game will unlock new items for you to get. Like at the start, you only get like a gun or a med kit, but soon you can unlock things like alarm clocks and wiring, and those will all come apparent. Shotgun at one point, but the point is the game will change, but not in a way you're kind of used to in a roguelike where the map will shift and things will change. The map pretty much stays static for the game. Major objectives might shift around, but the real thing that changes from playthrough to playthrough, and the thing that I think is its most interesting aspect, is the story itself will just completely change, and not the base story. You're always going into this cult to try and rescue somebody. What changes is the personality of the characters, and as such, the events that will surround your interactions with them. Sometimes the person you're going to rescue wants to be rescued. Sometimes they're super into it and they are not having your shenanigans. The game primarily plays like a stealth scenario. It's very reminiscent of classic Metal Gear games. With the top-down nature, with the stealth nature. Whenever you sneak, you can see the cone of vision of everyone around you, whether that's a NPC civilian or a guard. They're designated by different color cones, so you can know what to avoid. And it's a cool mechanic, but unfortunately, and I don't know why they decided to go with this, but the speed at which you stealth crawl is so agonizingly slow. It almost is as if the game is punishing you for playing it the way it's intended. And then you kind of just want to move and make something happen. You want to start going guns blazing. And while that is a viable option, it's not a great one. Ammo is not plentiful and you will die very quickly. However, there are some endings that can only be done through violence. It should be said that this game apparently has like 20 different endings. I have not achieved all 20 endings. I don't even know what all the criteria would be to do such a thing, but I think that's cool. Whether or not and because I haven't gotten all the endings, I don't quite know if the endings justify replaying it a bunch of times. Like, is there enough change in it, or is it a Mass Effect scenario where it's just a slight variation of what you already had before? Unfortunately, I can't answer that question. Hopefully Derek does in his point, or maybe we'll see a playthrough later. The stealth, the problem is the cool aspect of the narrative changing and the personality of the characters changing each playthrough is kind of undercut by how, what's the word I'm looking for? Generic or non-compelling or easily repetitive the core gameplay loop is, because it's run from room to room, loot things, avoid the cones while moving very slowly. You might have to disable some alarms. There are some side quests you can get from sympathetic or friendly NPCs, but for the most part, these playthroughs are quick bursts and not enough changes between them. Even if you pick a different starting item, and even with the changes to the narrative and the characters, every playthrough feels very similar to the one that came before it. And it's because of that I mean, roguelites are never my most popular or preferred genre to begin with. It takes very special ones to get me hooked. And unfortunately, when the gameplay all feels very samey and not enough changes, it's hard for me to recommend this one in that regard. But I do want to circle back to what I talked about with personalities changing, because the big draw of this game is the two preachers that run the cult, Rebecca and Isaac Walker. And their personality changes make the playthroughs the most interesting, because it's their voices that play over the PA system while you're playing the game a lot. You'll hear them most of the time. You'll interact with them. It's their voice acting that carries this game. And like during my first playthrough, Isaac was very passive and Rebecca was very like unhinged. And the Isaac character would repeatedly refer to his disappointment that he's not able to rein in Rebecca's more insane notions. And I thought that was cool. And I thought that was like their character dynamic until I played again. And then it was Isaac that was super aggressive and Rebecca was just as aggressive. I got caught, and the first time I got caught, they kind of put me in a cage, but I was given a chance to escape when they like walked away. They're like, "You'll sit here and think about what you did." The second time, they straight up murdered me. They drowned me in the river while still in the cage, saying that nothing I could say or do would convince them not to execute me. And it's things like that that kind of alleviated the gameplay tedium. I'm not even touching the fact of whether or not the way this game handles its touchy subject material is good or not. I can only comment on the fact that I enjoyed the changes to the main characters. It kept it a lot more viable as a game for me for a lot longer than if it just had to survive off of gameplay alone. That's kind of just all I've got. I wish the map itself was more diverse. It all takes place in a jungle setting, but the main areas look and feel very samey visually, which kind of sometimes throws you off when you're trying to maneuver and explore around. You can kind of find yourself in that scenario where you aren't quite sure if you've been here before, because everything kind of blurs together, but visually, the game is not a looker to begin with. I mean, we have some very pretty isometric games in the gaming industry, and this is not one of them. I will compliment it on its color palette. It's a bright game. It's not all browns and greens, even though it is in a jungle. They do a good job of that. all in all, if you really like roguelikes and the subject matter is really intriguing, I'd say it's worth a try, but I just don't see much long-term viability in this game versus other games in the same genre. Whether or not you call this the genre roguelite, an isometric stealth game, who even knows what the official term for this game is? A cult simulator, isometric twin stick shooter, stealth game with a changing narrative and multiple endings to unlock. I mean, it sounds cool when you put it that way, but the execution just wasn't enough for me to really recommend this game as a whole. That's all I got. This is Matthew. Saki bless. You guys have a great night.